The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
You've probably heard the headline before. Princess Diana, the people's princess, left everything to one person. Not the royal family, not the palace. One person. And for years, that single claim has been repeated in videos, articles, and late-night scrolling sessions until it started to feel like fact. But here's the twist nobody expects. The real story is stranger, messier, and far more human than the headline suggests. And once you see what actually happened inside Princess Diana's will, you'll understand why it still causes arguments inside Kensington Palace to this day. To understand her final decision, you have to understand the woman making it. Diana Frances Spencer wasn't born into the spotlight she'd eventually define. She grew up at Althorpe, in a family shaped by aristocratic tradition and a painful divorce between her parents. By the time she was 20, she was working as a kindergarten assistant, quiet and unassuming, when she met Prince Charles. Their wedding on the 29th of July, 1981, was watched by hundreds of millions of people. She walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in a gown with a 25-foot train, and for a moment, the world believed in fairy tales again. Behind the doors of the palace, the story was very different. Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles never fully disappeared, and Diana spent years feeling like an outsider in her own marriage. She later spoke openly about her struggles with bulimia, describing it as a private battle for control in a life where she often felt powerless. The institution she'd married into valued restraint above all else. Diana, by contrast, felt everything, and eventually, she stopped hiding it. By the early 90s, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. The so-called Camilla Gate tapes surfaced in 1992, exposing private conversations between Charles and Camilla, and the couple formally separated that same year. Then, in 1995, Diana did something no royal had done before. She sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama and spoke candidly about her marriage, her mental health, and her place within the monarchy. It wasn't just an interview. It was a declaration of independence. From that point on, Diana redefined what royal life could look like. She danced with John Travolta at the White House. She shook hands with AIDS patients without gloves, at a moment in history when public fear and misinformation about the disease were still widespread. She walked through active minefields in Angola, wearing nothing more protective than a shirt and trousers, to draw global attention to the human cost of landmines. Where the institution around her prized composure, Diana used empathy as a form of influence, and it worked. Her charitable presence helped shift public attitudes and, in the case of landmines, helped build momentum toward an international treaty. Her divorce from Charles became final in 1996. She'd lost the title Her Royal Highness, but she'd gained something the palace couldn't touch: the ability to decide, entirely on her own terms, what would happen to what she'd built. That decision had actually been made years earlier, in June of 1993, when Diana signed her last will and testament. She would go on to amend it slightly following her divorce, but the core structure stayed the same. And it's in the details of that document, not in dramatic rumor, that the real story lives. Diana's will name 2 executors and trustees: her mother, the Honorable Frances Shand Kidd, and her elder sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale. Not Paul Burrell, her longtime butler, and not any single confidant holding the keys to her legacy. Her family, the 2 women who had known her since childhood, were the ones legally responsible for carrying out her wishes. That alone dismantles one of the most persistent myths about her estate. At the time of her death on the 31st of August 1997, Diana's estate was valued by the High Court of Justice at just over £21.7 million, more than $30 million at the time. After inheritance tax, the net value settled at roughly 12 to 17 million pounds, depending on how it's calculated. It wasn't the fortune tabloids like to imagine, but it was substantial, and every pound of it had a purpose behind it. The will itself set out a fairly straightforward structure. £50,000 was left directly to Paul Burrell, a recognition of his decade of service and personal closeness to her. A discretionary fund was established to benefit her sons, their future spouses and children, and select charities, and it included her wardrobe, including her iconic wedding dress. Diana's 17 godchildren were named as beneficiaries of sentimental items, keepsakes, and personal belongings. And the residuary estate, the bulk of what remained after debts, taxes, and specific gifts, was to be split evenly between William and Harry. But Diana didn't stop at the legal document. The day after signing her will, she wrote something called a letter of wishes, a supplementary note meant to guide her executors on matters the will itself didn't cover in detail. In it, she asked that all of her jewelry and 3/4 of her personal belongings go to William and Harry, with the remaining quarter divided among her godchildren. She reportedly hoped that one day, her sons' future wives might wear pieces of that jewelry, a wish that came true when William proposed to Kate Middleton with Diana's own engagement ring. Here's where the story takes its real turn, the one the headlines rarely tell you. A letter of wishes isn't legally binding in the way a will is. It's guidance, not instruction, and the language Diana used, phrases like discretion and wishes, gave her executors legal room to interpret it however they saw fit. In December of 1997, just months after Diana's death, her mother and sister quietly went to probate court and requested what's known as a variation order, a legal mechanism allowing them to distribute the estate differently than Diana had specified. The court granted it. Under that variation, everything changed. Instead of receiving their inheritance at 25, as Diana's will originally stated, William and Harry would now have to wait until they turned 30, though they could access income from the trust starting at 25. And instead of splitting 1/4 of Diana's personal belongings between her 17 godchildren, each godchild would receive a single item, chosen not by Diana, but by the executors themselves. The change was made without notifying the godchildren's parents, most of whom were still minors at the time, and it stayed largely out of public view for years. The story eventually surfaced, not through the will itself, but through an unrelated legal case, the criminal trial of Paul Burrell in 2002. Burrell had been accused of stealing more than 300 items belonging to Diana, including gowns, personal letters, and even gifts from William's christening. The trial collapsed abruptly when it emerged that Queen Elizabeth II recalled a private conversation with Burrell in which he told her he was safeguarding some of Diana's belongings, not stealing them. He was acquitted, and in the process, details about the handling of Diana's estate, including the quiet variation of her wishes, began working their way into public knowledge. For 17 years, the disputed collection, including Diana's wedding dress, was cared for by her brother, Earl Spencer, who displayed it as part of a touring exhibition called Diana, a celebration. The exhibit generated millions of dollars for charitable causes connected to her memory, and it wasn't until Harry turned 30 in 2014, 2 years after William reached the same milestone, that the full residuary estate, then worth roughly £10 million to each son, was finally released. So why does any of this matter? Because it reframes the entire narrative around Diana's final wishes. She didn't quietly hand her legacy to one mysterious figure operating in the shadows. She wrote a will grounded in family, structured her estate around her son's long-term security, and tried, through her letter of wishes, to extend generosity to the godchildren and staff she cared about. What actually happened afterward wasn't a hidden conspiracy. It was 2 grieving family members, entrusted with an enormous responsibility, making a legal decision they believed protected 2 young princes who had just lost their mother. That doesn't mean the decision was universally accepted. Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, was reportedly uncomfortable with aspects of how the estate was ultimately handled, and the delayed distribution meant William and Harry grew up watching pieces of their mother's life sit in storage and touring exhibitions rather than in their own hands. Harry has spoken publicly about how significant his eventual inheritance was to him. In his 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey, he said plainly that what his mother left him made it possible for him and Meghan to build an independent life after stepping back from royal duties. It wasn't abstract money. It was, in his words, quite literally what allowed them to do what they did. Paul Burrell's role in all of this is worth clarifying too, because it's often exaggerated into something it never was. He wasn't the executor of Diana's estate, and he never held legal authority over her fortune. What he did inherit was £50,000 and, arguably, something less tangible. A public association with Diana's memory that he leaned into for years afterward through books like A Royal Duty and In the Royal Manor. That decision to write about his time with Diana has remained controversial, with some viewing it as a continuation of loyalty and others viewing it as a breach of the trust she placed in him. But legally, financially, he was a beneficiary, not a gatekeeper. The broader impact of Diana's charitable legacy is where the real, verifiable weight of her estate lies. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund channeled resources toward causes she'd championed in life, including HIV and AIDS awareness and support for landmine victims. Her early, visible work visiting AIDS patients helped chip away at the stigma and fear surrounding the disease at a time when public understanding was limited. Her walk through a minefield in Angola in January 1997 brought international attention to a humanitarian crisis, and later that same year, the Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmines was signed, a campaign that would go on to receive the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. None of that required a secret trust or a hidden clause. It required a woman willing to use her public platform in ways the institution around her found uncomfortable. What makes the true story more compelling than the myth isn't a hidden butler pulling strings from the shadows. It's the far more relatable reality of a family navigating grief, legal technicalities, and difficult decisions under intense public scrutiny, all while trying to honor the wishes of someone they'd lost too soon. Diana's mother and sister weren't villains, scheming behind closed doors. They were executors doing what estate law allowed them to do, informed by their own judgment about what would protect William and Harry best. And maybe that's the more powerful lesson buried in all of this. Diana spent her adult life pushing back against an institution that valued silence over honesty, protocol over compassion. Her will, imperfect and eventually altered as it was, still carried her intentions forward. Her sons were provided for. Her godchildren were remembered, even if not in the exact proportion she'd hoped. Her charitable causes outlived her by decades, reshaping public health policy and international law in ways few private citizens ever manage. The truth doesn't need embellishment to be remarkable. It's remarkable on its own. So the next time you see a headline claiming Princess Diana secretly left her entire fortune to one mysterious figure, you'll know the real answer. She left it to her family, structured with care, complicated by grief, and ultimately shaped as much by the people who survived her as by the woman who wrote it. That's not a scandal. That's simply what happens when love, loss, and legal reality collide, even inside a story as extraordinary as Princess Diana's. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing for more deep dives that separate royal history from royal rumor. And let us know in the comments, which part of Diana's real story surprised you the most?